Hey guys, it's Dan, and today we're going to be talking about the Cold War. Now, the Cold War was considered cold because it never actually developed into any kind of armed conflict between the US and the USSR.
Dan, why is it considered a war? Aren't people supposed to die and stuff for it to be considered a war?
Well, me from the past, it was still a time of intense fear and confrontation between the two nations. For 46 years until the Cold War's end in 1991, there was constant threat of a destructive, terrible nuclear war.
You know what they say, there's no time for Stalin in the USSR, as they were rushing to make their marks.
At the conclusion of World War II, it was clear that there were two dominant countries ruling over the world, the Communist Soviet Union and the democratic capitalist United States. As the United States spread its influence of democracy and freedom all over Western Europe and North America, the Soviets spread communism Eastern Europe, South America, and Asia, effectively dividing the world between the democratic West and the communist East. Now, the U.S. was hell-bent on getting rid of communism, and the Soviets wanted to put an end to free market and capitalism. This was sure to end badly, but it kind of didn't. Sure, there was intense paranoia as both the U.S. and the Soviets rapidly armed themselves with nuclear weapons. And sure, the Cuban Missile Crisis spread fear that nuclear weapons and missiles would destroy the southern United States and ensure Soviet takeover. But nothing actually happened in terms of armed conflict, so the conflict between the two superpowers never really became heated. So what started this whole war? Following World War II, the United States began an economic boom that brought unparalleled prosperity to the majority of its citizens, raising American expectations and breeding a belief that most economic and social problems could be solved. There was increasing nationalism and a strong belief that the capitalist system and democracy really did work. However, the post-war Reconstruction period in the Soviet Union was quite different than its allied partner. Its economy had been devastated in the struggle, and roughly a quarter of the country's capital resources had been destroyed. And in 1945, national morale plummeted as industrial and agricultural output began to fall far short of pre-war levels. In addition to this internal struggle, the Allies now had to decide what to do with the shattered nations of Europe due to their recent defeat of the Axis powers in World War II. This included Germany, which was in shambles and had no functioning government. The Soviet Union was incredibly determined to spread their communist philosophy worldwide and were also petrified of the notion of another German invasion. They planned to establish pro-Soviet communist governments not only in Germany, but in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, creating a communist buffer between them and Germany. The United States, along with other capitalistic nations of the world, obviously had major problems with this and responded to it with the policy of containment, using numerous strategies to prevent the spread of communism abroad without armed conflict or possibly nuclear war. The U.S. would allow communism to stay where it was, but would not tolerate the spreading of such policies around the world. This problem was somewhat resolved at the Potsdam Conference of 1945, as the Allied powers reluctantly agreed to divide Germany and the city of Berlin into zones of occupation, with the eastern sectors placed under Soviet Communist administration. This was disappointing to Stalin, and him, being the man that he was, decided to tighten domestic controls, justifying the repression of his people by playing up the threat of war with the West. Many repatriated Soviet citizens who had lived abroad during the war, whether as prisoners of war, forced laborers, or defectors, were executed or sent to prison camps. The limited freedoms granted in wartime to the church and collective farmers were revoked. The party also tightened its admission standards and purged many who had become party members during the war.
From the containment policy came the Truman Doctrine, the principle that the U.S. should give support to the countries or peoples threatened by Soviet forces or communist insurrection. This doctrine was huge. In the development of the war, it was seen by the communists as an open declaration of the Cold War. President Truman responded to criticism of this policy, saying that it must be the policy of the United States to support the people who are resisting attempted subjugation by outside pressures. Also later that year, U.S. leaders introduced the Marshall Plan, a diplomatic initiative that provided aid to friendly nations to help them rebuild their war-damaged infrastructures and economies. Events of the following year prompted American leaders to adopt a more militaristic stance towards the Soviets. As a result, in February 1948, a coup sponsored by the Soviet Union overthrew the democratic government of Czechoslovakia and brought that nation firmly into the communist camp. Within a few days, the U.S. leaders agreed to join discussions aimed at forming a joint security agreement with our European allies. It was primarily a security pact stating that a military attack against any of the signatories would be considered an attack against them all. The first NATO Secretary General, Lord Ismay, stated in 1949 that the organization's goal was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. This sense of militarism was furthered in U.S. in 1950 when a National Security Council report known as NSC-68 had echoed Truman's recommendation that the country use military force to contain communist expansionism anywhere it seemed to be occurring. To that end, the report called for a fourfold increase in military defense spending. In addition, American officials encouraged the development of atomic weapons like the ones that had ended World War II. Thus began a deadly nuclear arms race. However, prospect of a nuclear war had been brewing for years before NSC-68. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in Kazakhstan. This event officially ended America's monopoly on atomic weaponry. Besides the development of nuclear weapons, the U.S., specifically President Harry Truman, passed the Mutual Security Act of 1951, which launched a major American foreign aid program. The main goal was to help poor countries develop and to once again contain the spread of communism. Although this was a good start to non-violently defeating communists, the U.S. was also prepared for the worst, as in 1952, America tested the first hydrogen bomb, beating the Russians in the creation of the super bomb. This was one of the first instances where nuclear war felt inevitable. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died, which led his successor, Georgy Malenkov, to seize power in Russia. Almost overnight, the whole atmosphere of the Cold War seemed to change. Malenkov promptly announced his government's willingness to resolve international disputes peacefully, thus inaugurating a peace blitz that continued in fits and starts for nearly a decade.
A few months after Stalin's death, the dictator's mantra of incompatible conflicts between the capitalist and communist camps had been replaced by peaceful coexistence, as many ceasefires were attained in many Asian countries. But despite these positive signs, the Cold War continued on even after Stalin's death. By the end of the decade, the most divisive issues remained unsettled despite repeated pledges by both sides of their willingness to resolve the East-West conflict as soon as possible. This continuing unrest worldwide was once again displayed in January 1954 when U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles announced the policy that came to be known as massive retaliation. Any major Soviet attack would be met with a massive nuclear response. As a result to the challenge of massive retaliation came the most significant byproduct of the Cold War, the intercontinental ballistic missile. The technology of this new missile was unprecedented. As a result, ballistic missiles became sufficiently accurate and powerful enough to destroy targets 8,000 kilometers. The doctrine was passed on January 5, 1957, which is also Dan's birthday, and it was a foreign policy that promised military or economic aid to any Middle Eastern country needing help in resisting communist aggression. It was a continuation of the U.S. policy of resisting the Soviet sphere of influence. Now back to America. The Eisenhower Doctrine was passed in order to prevent instances like what happened in Cuba occurring to other countries in the Middle East.
Now, let's head to the thought bubble. Let me elaborate. In Cuba, the newly crowned communist rebels were led by the charismatic leader, Fidel Castro. Fidel saw the Soviets as allies and allowed them to harbor nuclear weapons on the island secretly.
Oh no.
Once the U.S. discovered that the Soviets were in the process of positioning nuclear missiles, the president at the time, John F. Kennedy, yes, another president, the fourth out of the 9 that served during the Cold War, blockaded Cuba and immediately sent a naval blockade to stop Soviet ships carrying missiles to Cuba. JFK announced his position, saying that
nuclear weapons are so destructive and ballistic missiles are so swift that any substantially increased possibility of their use or any sudden change in their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace.
Following a period of intense discussions and fear of nuclear catastrophe, President Kennedy made a proposal to Nikita Khrushchev that the Soviet leader accepted. The Soviets withdrew the missiles after the U.S. pledged publicly never to invade Cuba and promised privately to withdraw its own nuclear missiles from Turkey. From the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides learned that risking nuclear war in pursuit of political objectives was simply too dangerous. It was the last time during the Cold War that either side would take this risk. However, the U.S. and the USSR still superimposed their competition on local conflicts in other parts of the globe. So over the next 20-plus years, the relationship between the Soviet Union and the U.S. improved slightly, and in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev assumed the reins of power in the Soviet Union, he brought along with him change. A dedicated reformer, Gorbachev introduced the policies of glasnost and perestroika to the USSR. Glasnost, or openness, meant a greater willingness on the part of Soviet officials to allow Western ideas and goods into the USSR. Perestroika was an initiative that allowed limited market incentives to Soviet citizens. Gorbachev hoped these changes would be enough to spark the sluggish Soviet economy.
Now it's time for the open letter. An open letter to Mikhail Gorbachev. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment. Look, the keys of freedom. They're hot. Almost as hot as me. This letter is cold. Almost as cold as the Cold War. Dear Mikhail Gorbachev, you proved that it was not necessary to be a paranoid sociopath like Stalin or such a dangerous annoyance like Khrushchev to be a revered ruler of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. If either of those guys were at least kind of smart like you, the Cold War would not have happened, and there wouldn't have been any paralyzing fear that the entire world would be destroyed in nuclear war. Everyone gives Reagan the credit for telling you to tear down the wall, but you were really doing it by yourself. After finally realizing that 1, Russia was big enough as it was, and 2, maybe state-controlled everything was not the way to go, we thank you for taking part in this 45-year conflict, even though you really get no credit. Yours truly, Dan. Freedom, however, is addictive. Like dominoes, Eastern European communist dictatorships fell one by one. By the fall of 1989, East and West Germans were tearing down the Berlin Wall with pickaxes.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The Soviet Union was looking less and less intimidating as in 1987, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and U.S. President Reagan signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Act. This was the first arms accord signed by both Moscow and Washington that called for the elimination of an entire class of weapon. Demands for freedom soon spread to the Soviet Union. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania declared independence. Talks of similar sentiments were heard in Ukraine and Central Asia. Here, Gorbachev wished to draw the line. Self-determination for Eastern Europe was one thing, but he intended to maintain the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union. That summer, a coup by conservative hardliners took place. Gorbachev was placed under house arrest. Meanwhile, Boris Yeltsin, the leader of the Russian Soviet Republican, demanded the arrest of the hardliners. The army and the public sided with Yeltsin, and the coup failed. Though Gorbachev was freed, he was left with little legitimacy. Nationalist leaders like Yeltsin were far more popular than Gorbachev could ever hope to become. In December of 1991, Ukraine and Russia declared themselves independent, and the Soviet Union was dissolved. Gorbachev was a president without a country, and the Cold War was officially over. A special thanks to Miss Donahue for being the best history teacher we ever had, and also a big shout out to this kid for giving us a hand. Don't forget to be awesome.